Well, hello there, and welcome back to Freud's Funky Findings podcast. In this episode, I'll introduce you to my personal favorite subject as a psychology student. Drumroll, please. Okay, I know this sounds kind of more like knocking, but it's just my one-handed drumroll because I'm also holding the microphone. But anyways, my favorite subject is social psychology. And that's because I personally find human behavior truly fascinating, except when I find it maddening, disturbing, and infuriating. But all kinds of questions I've always had growing up, like why we act different alone versus around others, why we form groups, and how we create social identity, are all topics that social psychology is centered around. And the basis of modern-day social psychology is so-called social cognition. Little throwback to the first episode when I talked about how general psychology focuses on how people generally think and feel, so that individual psychology can explore specific things that they think and feel. And my understanding is that social cognition kind of does the same, focusing on the perception, processing, and interpretation of social information, so that complex social dynamics, personal sentiments, and specific behaviors can be explored. So, social cognition is about what we do with social information. Social information can be any cue, detail, or stimulus that people use to either express themselves or to navigate themselves in social settings. This can involve intrapersonal processes, so happening within someone's own mind, like the construction of their worldview or the identification of certain goals they want to accomplish. These are things we'll address in later episodes. On the other hand, we have the interpersonal aspects of social cognition, like reacting to others, forming groups, and communicating with others. And that's exactly where we're going to start today: communication. What might instantly come to mind here are verbal interactions, discussions, conversations, disputes, greetings, etc. And it makes sense that we consider speech to be the primary form of communication, because speech production involves conscious choices about what we want to talk about, what words we use, and how we might adapt our rhetoric according to the situation. And this enables us to have some control of how we present ourselves towards the outside world. However, this is where we've officially run into the so-called humans think they have everything under control, including their brain problem, which is a super scientific term that I personally like to use, referring to the wrongful assumption that we as humans are in perfect control of what our brains do, what information they use, how they process that information, and how they create our image of the world, when in reality, a huge part of how we perceive one another is based on communication we aren't even aware of. Nonverbal communication refers to the transmission of messages through means other than speech or writing, like body language, facial expressions, or proxemics, which I'll also explain in just a few minutes. Nonverbal messages transport a huge variety of social information. They indicate group membership, such as age, gender, or cultural background, showcase social orientation, meaning dominance or affiliation, and inform about one's personal characteristics, like competence, trustworthiness, or emotional states. As Austrian-American psychologist Paul Watzlawick famously noted, you cannot not communicate. Every behavior carries communicative value, not just written or spoken language. Even silence, which is in many cases viewed as the absence of reaction, can transmit certain messages. For example, that one Christmas where we decided with my cousins that instead of preparing gifts for everyone in the family, we would just showcase our acrobatic capabilities, combining gymnastics and contemporary dance into one glorious performance to I Believe I Can Fly on Christmas Eve. I believe we created a new world record of how many times one can almost kick another kid's teeth out. And after we'd finished our performance, our efforts were greeted with about a minute of deep silence, which was ultimately broken by my grandma, who said, "It is impossible to put into words the value of what we just seen." I'm now convinced she could have had a spectacular career as a diplomat. Well, anyways, back to the idea of nonverbal communication and how we don't control every message we send to others. Let's make a throwback to the episode of our best bud, Sigmund Freud, who popularized the idea of the subconscious. He described this as a dimension of the mind containing our hidden hopes and desires that were deemed socially unacceptable and thus pushed out of our conscious mind. However, the unconscious would sometimes interfere and reveal itself when our conscious control is reduced, like when we're tired or stressed, resulting in the infamous Freudian slip. The German psychologist Friedmann Schulz von Thun applied this idea onto communication. According to him, each message we send to our surroundings has 4 layers: a factual level, a relational component, a self-revelation, and an appeal. Let's take the example of you telling your snoring partner to turn around. The self-revelation component might sound something like, "I'm rotting at the office all day, cooking, cleaning, trying not to kill the kids, and looking cute doing it. If you don't shut up now, I might just have to reenact a scene from a Hitchcock movie." The relational component might be, "I feel comfortable enough telling you this," or "Do you actually enjoy torturing me like this?" And lastly, the appeal would most likely be, "Shut your pretty little mouth," or nose, or whatever it is that people do the snoring with. So in a nutshell, this theory proposes that whenever we want to send a message, we communicate information on various different levels. This highlights how much the relationship between sender and receiver plays into how the message is understood, and that one message can contain various different pieces of information. Adding to that complexity, other theories propose that most communication happens via multiple different channels. A rather famous model is Klaus Scherer's expanded lens model from 1978, which focuses on the perception of emotion. According to Scherer, emotion isn't only communicated through one channel of expression, like verbal content, but also simultaneously through tone, facial expressions, and posture. The way in which we express and sort of package our message is called encoding, like we're making up a code for what we actually want to say. The various channels of expression that transport the encoded message can either all point in the same direction, like when my grandma would say that Elvis Presley was some treat when his songs would come on retro radio, even though her face had already generously expressed her affections towards the man after the first couple of beats. Or instead, the message sent via different channels can be ambiguous and contradict one another. Like when my little brother used to offer to share his sweets with me, asking, "Do you want some?" but his face actually saying, "Take some if you dare." He's improved a lot on that though. This makes it difficult to determine which channel to trust and thus what the hell the other person actually wants to say. Another difficulty is that the receiver will always have a subjective interpretation of the sender's true message. The majority of the time, the encoded message doesn't equal the decoded message, so the message the receiver actually gets. And this is because our past experiences, surroundings, and personality all influence how we interpret messages. Due to all these factors, Scherer regards communication not as a deterministic process, which would be like I throw my pen up in the air and it's going to fall back down eventually, but as a probabilistic process. If I keep having lunch at the law faculty's canteen, even though I study psychology, I might or I might not meet my future rich husband one day. Furthermore, according to Scherer's model, emotional communication also involves so-called feedback loops, meaning the sender transmits an emotional message through different channels, the receiver perceives these expressions and decodes the message, then reacts in a certain way, which determines what the next emotional message of the sender is going to be. So let's recap what we've learned so far. Communication can happen intentionally or unintentionally, and verbally or non-verbally. One single expression contains various different pieces of information about the relationship between sender and receiver, and one single message can be communicated through various different channels of expression. The encoded message mostly isn't represented perfectly in the decoded message, as the decoding process is influenced by the receiver's own past experiences and surroundings. And lastly, emotional communication, and I think it's safe to say any communication for that matter, involves feedback loops where both parties react to the feedback they received from the other person. Now let's talk some more about nonverbal cues. Facial expressions play a central role in emotional communication. One, Charles Darwin, proposed that they directly reflect internal emotional states, signaling to other members of our group if there is a reason for fear, excitement, regret, or content. In contrast, others argued that facial expressions primarily serve social signaling functions, meaning they're something we can consciously use to assert our interests. For example, one might smile not just out of pure happiness, but also to seem friendly. Modern views assume polyvalence, meaning the same expression can serve multiple different social functions. The way in which we display emotion may be mixed, shaped by both genuine feelings and desires to be perceived in a certain way. But nonverbal communication extends beyond the face. Another important component is body language. You might have already observed yourself that the more space a person takes up physically, standing up straight, arms unfolded by their side and head held high, the more comfortable and self-confident they seem. But another aspect of body language is actually not how you stand, it's where you stand. Let me introduce you to the concept of proxemics, referring to the idea that the physical distances between two people can indicate the social distance between them as well. Proxemics distinguish intimate distance from 0 to 45 centimeters, personal distance from 45 to 120 centimeters, social distance from 1.2 to 3.6 meters, and public distance beyond 3.6 meters. So the physical distance a person maintains from others helps determine emotional closeness, comfort, and the nature of the social relationship. Nonverbal cues also contribute to group dynamics. Dominance is expressed through expansive gestures, space use, and physical strength. Studies have even shown that hitting puberty early can lead to the development of dominant behavior, because people who entered this phase before their peers were physically superior to them for a certain amount of time. In contrast, submission is signaled through yielding gestures and making yourself small. Submissive individuals might also mirror the body language and facial expressions of the other person, as they are more susceptible to emotional contagion, so to mimicking the other's emotional state. So now we've talked about verbal and nonverbal cues, the various different levels of messages the multiple expression channels of messages, and what social implications they have. Seems quite complex if you ask me. It was even more so when I heard all this stuff for the first time in our big cold lecture room. So, how do people actually deal with all this complexity of communication in their everyday lives? Well, actually, pretty flipping well. Turns out some people really know how to stare into your soul. Thin slicing refers to the ability to judge a person's personality, emotional states, or future behavior based on a very brief observation of their behavior, typically less than 5 minutes. This term was coined by Nalini Ambady and Robert Rosenthal in 1992. They conducted a study where random observers watched muted 10-second video clips of teachers they did not know. The result was that the observers' ratings of the teachers on traits like warmth and confidence highly correlated with the end-of-semester evaluations given by the teachers' actual students. In the upcoming episodes on social psychology, we're going to talk about what we do with these thin slices and our perceptions of others. For now, I hope you've enjoyed this episode and maybe learned something about communication. Maybe an important lesson is that you always have to be cautious of what you're putting out there, willingly or inadvertently. I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. And just so you know, I'm nodding while saying this, so I actually mean it. And take care until next time. Bye-bye.